Driving a truck across long stretches of open road has a rhythm to it that can lull you into thinking you've seen everything there is to see. For me, Eastern Washington was one of those routes I knew well. Miles of state roads cut through farmland, open plains, and scrubby hills. Not many towns out there, and definitely not many rest stops, but I knew about the dirt pull-off areas that showed up every 40 miles or so. They were huge, flat, and well away from the highway, good enough for pulling over to get a few hours of rest. That night, I had been driving since early morning and the fatigue had caught up to me. I pulled into one of those big dirt lots, parked, and killed the engine. The world outside was pitch black except for the faint light of the stars overhead. I closed my blinds, got comfortable in the sleeper, and let myself relax. My plan was to watch something on my phone until I fell asleep, just part of the routine when you spend so many nights out there alone. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear the faint whistle of the wind across the flat land outside. No other trucks, no passing cars, nothing. About an hour later, just as I was starting to doze, I heard the driver's side door handle rattle. It was distinct, the sound of someone testing the latch. My stomach dropped instantly because I knew what I had heard. My truck was locked, but the sound was unmistakable. I hadn't heard a single vehicle pass since I parked, so the thought of someone being out there made the hair on my arms stand up. I slid out of the bunk carefully, trying not to make any sound, and moved toward the curtains at the front. I only peeked a little, just enough to see black glass staring back at me. Nothing. No outline of a person, no flashlight, no movement. Then, before I could process it, the passenger side handle rattled. My head whipped around to the sound, and my pulse was pounding. I leaned forward, pressed my eye to the top gap in the curtain. Again, nothing. At that point, fear had taken over. I climbed into the seat, started the engine, and flipped on the headlights. The beams swept across the dirt lot, cutting through the emptiness. Nothing was there. No cars, no person standing near my doors, no movement in the distance. Just a huge, flat space lit up by my truck's headlights and nothing to explain what I had just heard. I sat there for a minute, breathing hard, before shutting the lights and engine off. My hands were trembling, but I tried to reason with myself. It was windy outside. Maybe the gusts had pushed against the handles somehow, or something blew against the doors. I pulled the sleeper curtains closed tight, telling myself if I couldn't see outside, I didn't need to worry. It sounds stupid now, but at the time, I needed that barrier to convince myself I was safe. I laid back down, phone in hand, trying to watch something mindless to distract myself. That's when I heard it again, but not the handles this time. It was a scraping, prying sound, right above me, near the sleeper vents. Then the door handles clicked again, one after another, almost like someone was moving around the cab, testing each entry point. The entire truck shifted faintly, the way it does when weight moves across it. My chest tightened. Someone was climbing on my truck. I grabbed for the little panic alarm button in the sleeper and hit it. The shrill sound filled the cab, but it didn't scare them off. If anything, it seemed to mix into the noise, the clicking handles, the tapping on glass, the light thuds against the chassis. I could even hear the hiss of air leaving the suspension as the truck shifted under uneven weight. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then silence. Just like that, everything stopped. No handles, no tapping, no shifting of weight. Only my breathing and the faint ringing of the alarm as I shut it off. I stayed frozen in place, every muscle tense, waiting for it to start again. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe more. Then I heard it. A low rumble, faint at first but growing louder. Headlights spilled briefly across the inside of my curtains. Another truck passed by on the road, engine growling as it headed into the distance. And then it was gone, leaving me back in silence. The rest of that night, I barely slept. I laid awake in the bunk, every nerve on edge, waiting for the sound of handles rattling again. But nothing came back. When the first light of morning crept in through the curtains, I finally got up. I stepped outside cautiously, half expecting to find footprints in the dirt, or maybe a car parked nearby. The lot was empty. The ground was flat and hard-packed, so there were no prints I could see. No marks of anyone having been there. I walked around the truck slowly, scanning every inch. No scratches on the paint, no dents, nothing broken or tampered with. But when I looked at the windows, I froze. All over the glass, driver's side, passenger side, sleeper windows were handprints. Small, smeared outlines like a child had pressed sticky hands against them. They were low on the glass in places, higher in others, dozens of them. It looked like someone had licked their palms and pressed them against every window, over and over. The prints were faint in some spots, clearer in others, but they covered every window on my cab. I stood there staring at them in the morning light, feeling that same chill wash over me. Whoever or whatever had been out there hadn't been trying to break in for money or tools. They hadn't tried to smash glass or force a lock. They had just circled my truck, climbing and pressing their hands against every surface, like they wanted me to know they were there. I wiped the glass clean before I left, but that image has never left my mind. The empty dirt lot, the silence of the night, the sound of my truck shifting under someone's weight, and those tiny handprints smeared across every window. To this day, I can't explain it, and I've never stopped at that pull-off again. Some nights on the road stick with you, and this one has stayed with me like a scar. I've been driving trucks long enough to know that most strange noises in the night have a simple explanation. Still, it doesn't matter how many miles you've put in or how many nights you've spent parked in the middle of nowhere. When you're alone in the dark with only thin walls of glass and metal between you and whatever's outside, your mind plays tricks. This was a few years back when I was running long hauls through the Midwest. I had pulled into one of those dirt lots off a state highway, a spot I'd used plenty of times before. It wasn't an official rest stop, just a wide gravel turnout where trucks could get well off the road. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and I was running on fumes. I killed the engine, stretched out in the sleeper, and let the silence settle in. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. No cars passing, no hum of distant traffic, no houses or barns nearby. Just still air and darkness pressing in on all sides. I cracked a window for air, drew the curtains, and laid back to watch something on my phone until my eyes got heavy. First, everything was normal. Then I started hearing little noises, light thuds, a faint scrape, the kind of sound that makes you tilt your head and wonder if you imagined it. I ignored it, told myself it was just the wind or maybe settling gravel. But then came the tapping. It was soft at first, like fingers drumming lightly against glass. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. A few minutes later, another faint tap, but this time from the opposite side of the cab. I froze, listening hard, my body tense. Out here, miles from anyone, the idea of someone creeping around your truck is enough to tie your stomach in knots. I slowly pulled back a corner of the curtain and peered out. The headlights were off, but the moon gave just enough light to make out the empty lot around me. Nothing. No figures moving, no car parked nearby. I held my breath and scanned every shadow, but the world outside was still. Then came a new sound, a scratching at the edge of the cab, right below the window. It was followed by another and another, almost like little hands dragging claws along the metal. My first thought was raccoons. I'd heard plenty of stories about them climbing onto trucks, pawing at food wrappers or trying to get into trash. They were smart, bold, and not afraid to poke around. But hearing it in the moment, alone in that sleeper, was something else entirely. My heart was pounding. I pressed my ear to the curtain, listening as the sounds moved from one side of the truck to the other. Every few minutes there'd be a faint thump, like something had hopped up and landed on the fender or maybe even the step rail. I sat there debating whether to start the engine and spook them off, but another part of me didn't want to move. It felt like whatever was out there was circling, testing, waiting for me to react. The minutes dragged on, my nerves stretched thin. Finally, after what felt like an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. I climbed into the seat, fired up the engine, and flipped on the headlights. The beams washed across the dirt lot, lighting up dust and weeds. And there they were, 4 raccoons caught in the light, frozen mid-scurry. One stood on the step rail, its little hands pressed against the door window, smudges marking the glass. The others darted away toward the edge of the lot, their eyes glowing back at me. I let out a shaky laugh, the kind that comes when tension finally breaks. My chest was still tight, but seeing them explained everything, the tapping, the scratching, the thuds. They weren't intruders, just hungry scavengers sniffing around. But even with the explanation clear in front of me, I couldn't shake the unease. There's something about those little hands, the way they press against the glass almost like fingers, the way they move so quietly until they're right next to you. For hours, I had pictured someone circling my truck, testing the doors, looking for a way in. And in a way, I wasn't wrong. It was just raccoons instead of people. I cleaned the prints off the next morning before I rolled out. Dozens of them covered the windows, oily smears where their paws had pressed again and again. It was almost worse in daylight, seeing how many times they had tried to climb, how much of the night they had spent circling me. The funny thing is that memory stuck with me far longer than it should have. I've had close calls on icy roads. I've seen wrecks that made my stomach turn, and I've spent nights parked in places rougher than I'd like to admit. But nothing ever felt quite like that long night in the dirt lot, listening to unseen hands tapping and scratching on every side of my truck. And even though I know it was just raccoons, every time I hear a little noise outside the cab when I'm parked in the middle of nowhere, my heart still jumps the same way. Because out here, in the dark, it doesn't take much to remind you how thin the walls are and how alone you really are. I've been a truck driver for years now, and I'll be honest, nothing creeps me out more than being parked at some desolate truck stop or rest area in the middle of the night. Most people don't realize how dark it gets out there when you're far from the city, how still everything feels when you shut off that engine, and how every noise carries through the night like it's right beside you. Even after years on the road, I still get those uneasy moments where my imagination starts to play tricks on me. One particular night sticks in my memory more than any others. I had been running a long route across state lines, one of those jobs where you're awake well past midnight just trying to make good time. I was already worn down, and I knew I needed to stop before fatigue caught up to me. So I pulled into one of those little highway pull-off spots, not the big lit-up truck stops with 20 rigs lined up, but one of the smaller rest areas where you might be lucky to see another car or two. It was about 2:30 in the morning, the kind of time where even the birds and insects seem to go quiet for a while. I cut the engine, rolled the window down just a crack for some air, and sat there for a bit before crawling into the sleeper. That's when I noticed how completely silent it was. No traffic going by, no crickets, nothing but the occasional ping of the truck engine cooling off. That kind of silence gets under your skin because you realize how far you are from anyone else. I finally got into the back, stretched out, and closed my eyes. I must have been half asleep when I first heard it. A scratching noise, faint at first, but enough to wake me up fully. It wasn't like a tree branch brushing against metal. It was sharper, more deliberate, like little nails dragging along the side of the truck. I held my breath and listened harder. There it was again. This time it was closer, right against the thin metal wall of the sleeper. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just the wind carrying debris across the lot. But it didn't sound like that. After a few minutes of silence, I started to drift again, only to jolt back awake when something actually thumped against the door. Not a big slam, but a quick, light impact, as if someone had slapped it with an open hand. My skin crawled instantly. I sat there in the dark, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling and feeling every nerve in my body tighten up. The scratching came again, this time higher up, near the window. I could hear the tiny dragging of something across the glass. I froze. The thought that raced through my mind was that someone was out there, testing the truck, trying to see if they could get in. I reached for the flashlight I keep beside my bed and just sat gripping it, trying to decide whether to turn it on or not. Then came the sound that nearly made me leap out of my skin. Something was tapping against the glass itself. Not once, but in a quick little series of taps, like knuckles rapping on a window. I swear I felt my heart skip. The window was only cracked an inch or two, and all I could picture was some set of hands trying to slide their way through. The memory that popped into my head right then was one I'd read online, about a kid who thought a ghost with little black hands was reaching into her room at night. The image was so clear in my mind that I could almost see those hands trying to snake through the crack in my own window. I couldn't take it anymore. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it straight at the glass. For a second, I saw nothing. just my own pale reflection and the glare of the light bouncing back. But then, out of the corner of my vision, something moved. I shifted the beam downward and there they were, two glowing eyes staring right back at me. I nearly dropped the flashlight. My brain went wild with panic for about half a second before I realized what I was actually seeing. Pressed right up against the glass, standing on the narrow side step of the truck, was a raccoon. Its little hands were splayed across the window, long fingers stretched out and twitching against the glass. The tapping, the scratching, all of it suddenly made sense. It wasn't some person trying to break in. It was this furry little thief trying to get a look inside my cab, probably smelling whatever food I had stored away. I sat there, breathing hard, watching as the raccoon tilted its head and kept patting at the window with those almost human-like hands. A second later, another one clambered up onto the step, and now I had two sets of glowing eyes staring at me, both of them scratching at the glass as if they expected me to open up and hand over a sandwich. For something so small, they had made me feel like I was living through a nightmare. I knocked on the glass with my fist, and that finally made them scurry off. I could hear their claws clicking against the pavement as they scrambled under the truck. For a while, I kept hearing little noises, like they were still circling, looking for scraps or a way in. I didn't even try to go back to sleep right away. I just sat upright in the sleeper, flashlight in hand, waiting for the quiet to return. Eventually, the silence came back, and the fear started to ease into something else. I actually felt kind of stupid, sitting there terrified of what turned out to be a couple of raccoons. But at the same time, I knew I wasn't overreacting. Out there, alone in the middle of the night, you can't take chances. You hear scratching on your window and you don't picture raccoons. You picture someone with bad intentions. And when you're miles from help, those thoughts get very real very fast. By the time I finally managed to relax again, the sky was just starting to lighten. I got out to check around the truck, and sure enough, there were muddy little paw prints all over the side step and streaks where their claws had dragged along the metal. If anyone else had come by, they probably would have laughed. But standing there and looking at that evidence made me realize how close I had been to letting my own fear spiral. To this day, every time I hear something outside the truck when I'm parked for the night, I remember that moment. I still get that jolt of fear first, the thought that maybe someone's out there with their hands pressed against the glass. But then I remind myself of the raccoons and how something so innocent can feel so terrifying when you're alone in the dark. That night stuck with me because it taught me how easily the mind can bend simple noises into something sinister. And it's the reason why, even after years on the road, I never fully sleep easy at those isolated rest stops. Because sure, sometimes it's just raccoons, but you never really know until you shine that light. I've been driving trucks for a long time. Most of my life has been spent behind the wheel, staring through the windshield at dark highways, narrow back roads, and miles of pavement with only the hum of my engine to keep me company. It's a lonely life, but it's one I chose, and over the years I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But there's one night that has never left me, and no matter how many loads I haul or how many states I cross, it always sits in the back of my head like a weight pressing down. It happened in Oregon, out in the forests where the roads twist like veins through endless walls of pine and fir. I had a contract that month hauling logs out of a site deep in the woods. The roads were rough and narrow, more dirt than pavement in some stretches, and there weren't many people around except the occasional trucker or someone from the logging crews. The air was cold and damp, the kind of chill that hangs low over the ground and seeps into your clothes. That night, I was running a late haul. It was around 2 in the morning, pitch black except for the cut of my headlights through the trees. My trailer was stacked high with logs, chained down tight, and the weight made the truck groan every time I leaned into a curve. I had the radio low, static humming more than music, and I remember thinking how quiet the world felt. Not just quiet, but empty in a way that only deep forest roads get at night. I came around a bend and saw it. Just a small car parked right at the edge of the tree line. A dark sedan, maybe 10 or 15 years old, sitting half off the gravel shoulder. The headlights weren't on, but I noticed right away that the engine was running. The faint glow of the dash lights shone inside, giving the windshield a dull green tint. It struck me as odd, because cars don't usually sit out there at that hour without a reason. People don't pull off in the middle of nowhere unless they're broken down or lost. As my truck rumbled closer, I glanced inside the car. There were two people sitting in the front seats. A man behind the wheel, a woman in the passenger seat. What got me wasn't that they were there. It was the way they were sitting, completely still, not moving, not shifting, not even glancing in my direction as I passed. Most folks, even if they're half asleep, will twitch or turn their head when a 40-ton truck roars by just a few feet away. But these two, they sat there like mannequins, rigid and frozen, staring straight ahead. I felt a tightness crawl up my neck as I drove past. Something about it didn't sit right. I looked in my mirror and saw the faint exhaust drifting up from the tailpipe, steady, like the car had just been started. I thought maybe they were resting, maybe they'd had too much to drink and were sleeping it off. But even then, people don't sit that still. Something about it gnawed at me, but I had a schedule to keep, and with a load of logs behind me, I couldn't exactly stop on a narrow forest road without risking someone coming around the bend and slamming into me. I shook it off and kept rolling, telling myself I was overthinking it. Strange things look stranger at night, I thought. I'd seen enough shadows and shapes on the road to know the mind plays tricks when it's dark and you're tired. Still, the image of them, motionless under that faint glow, stuck with me for miles. Hours later, after dropping the load and turning back, I came down the same stretch of road. The night was lighter now, closer to dawn, but the forest still pressed heavy on both sides. My headlights cut through the mist that had settled in, and I felt a strange dread before I even rounded the bend. Something inside me already knew, and there it was, the car. Same position, same angle against the tree line, engine still running. My stomach dropped. I slowed as much as I could without risking my trailer sliding on the gravel, and I turned my head to look. The two figures were still inside. Same posture, same stillness. Hours had passed, and they hadn't moved an inch. The man's hands rested on the wheel, his head tilted forward slightly, and the woman sat with her face pointed ahead, unmoving. The dashboard still glowed faint green. The exhaust still puffed steady from the tailpipe. It was wrong. Deeply wrong, the kind of wrong that settles into your bones. I drove on, but my hands were tight on the wheel, and every nerve in me screamed that I needed to do something. I replayed the sight over and over in my head as the miles rolled under me. By the time I hit the next stop with cell service, I pulled over and called it in. I gave them the mile marker, the description of the car, everything I could remember. The dispatcher didn't say much, just that they'd send someone out. The rest of that run felt endless. My gut churned with unease, and my mind wouldn't quit imagining what I'd seen. I kept wondering if I should have stopped, if I should have knocked on the window or tried to wake them. But I also knew how dangerous that could be. Out there in the woods at 2 a.m, you don't just walk up to a running car with strangers inside. Too many things could go wrong. It wasn't until the next day that I heard back. One of the guys from the yard mentioned that word had spread. The police had gone out to check the car. The two people inside, they were dead, both of them. The coroner said they'd been gone for hours before I ever drove past the first time. I remember standing there, my coffee going cold in my hand, and feeling a wave of cold dread wash over me. I had seen them. I had seen their bodies sitting upright in that car, engine idling, as if they were alive. But they weren't. They hadn't been for a long time. That thought stays with me. The silence of the forest, the steady hum of their idling engine, the way they sat so perfectly still as I passed. I can still picture the glow of the dashboard lights on their faces. I had driven by death without realizing it. The road looks the same when I haul through there now, but every time I pass that stretch, I feel the hair rise on my arms. I keep expecting to see another car parked there, headlights off, engine running, figures inside unmoving. And I know if I ever do, I'll feel that same sick chill again. It wasn't ghosts or anything out of a storybook. Just two people who died in the wrong place at the wrong time, and me, a trucker rolling past them in the dark, not knowing what I was really looking at. That's the truth of the road. You see things you can't explain, and sometimes the explanations are worse than anything your mind could invent. That night taught me something about silence, about stillness, about the way death can sit quietly in plain sight without announcing itself. And it taught me that no matter how many miles I drive, some images stay with you forever. I've been on the road most of my life, and one thing you learn pretty quick is that when you're tired behind the wheel, the world doesn't always behave the way you think it should. Distances stretch, minutes melt, landmarks appear where you don't expect them, and sometimes you're left wondering if your brain is playing tricks on you or if you really did slip into some strange pocket of time. I've had more than my share of long hauls where hours felt like minutes and minutes felt like hours, but there's one trip that sticks with me more than any other. And it was the night I realized just how fragile my grip on the road can be when exhaustion takes hold. It was summer, years ago, and I'd been hired for a run that took me across a long stretch of canyon highway in the southwest. The run itself wasn't unusual. Standard delivery, nothing hazardous, no ticking clock breathing down my neck. But I was already worn down from a string of back-to-back hauls and hadn't had a proper night's sleep in more than a week. I figured I'd push through, take it easy, and rest once I was back near the yard. That kind of thinking catches up with you fast. The canyon road I had to cross that night was one I'd been through plenty of times. Drivers all know it. Two-lane blacktop squeezed between walls of rock. A winding path that eats up about 30 minutes with no real chance for cell service. There are only a handful of markers along the way. An old pull-off, a radio tower on the far ridge, a couple of sandstone buttes that rise above the road like watchmen. They make the place easy to recognize, easy to measure in your head. Or at least that's what I thought. By the time I rolled into the canyon, it was just past midnight. My dash clock showed 12:05. The road was empty. Not a pair of headlights in either direction. Just me, the rumble of the truck, and the soft thump of tires rolling over uneven pavement. I kept the radio low, more for background noise than anything else, and tried to keep my eyes sharp by focusing on the details around me. The bend of the road, the shadow of rock formations, the faint glint of the guardrail. First, everything felt normal. I traced the curves like I'd done before, knowing each twist well enough that I didn't have to check the GPS. About 10 minutes in, I passed the first of those sandstone buttes. Tall, weathered, like a broken tooth pushing out of the desert floor. I remember noting the time, 12:15. I figured I was making good progress. But then, things started to feel off. The conversation in my head, the little mental notes I made to stay alert, got hazy. I'd catch myself staring too long at the yellow center line, or blinking and realizing the last mile had passed without me recalling much of it. Fatigue does that, you zone out, then snap back. I told myself to stay sharp. A little while later, I passed the butte again. Same shape, same jagged shadow leaning across the asphalt. My first thought was that my eyes were playing tricks, that maybe there were two formations that just looked similar. But the details stuck. Those same cracks, the way the moonlight cut across its face. It was the same one. My clock read 12:40. I sat up straighter, gripped the wheel tighter. The canyon isn't that long. By 40 minutes in, I should have been nearing the exit, not circling back to familiar rock. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was driving slower than I realized. Maybe the stories I'd been running through in my head had dragged my attention away, made the road feel longer than it was. That happens. Still, it didn't explain why I'd seen the same butte twice. Another 10, maybe 15 minutes ticked by, though it felt like longer. The road kept winding, and I kept waiting to see the canyon open up into the flatlands beyond. Instead, the butte showed itself again, leaning over the highway like a silent marker. This time I knew it wasn't a mistake. My stomach turned, a heavy knot sitting just under my ribs. My clock read 1:05. I should have been miles out of the canyon, but I was still locked in the same stretch. By then, every nerve in me was humming. I shut off the radio, opened the window to let in the sharp desert air, forced myself to pay attention to every line of the road. With the window down, I could hear the engine more clearly, steady and constant. The world outside was silent, no crickets, no rustle of wind, Nothing but the hum of tires and the occasional ping of gravel spitting out from under the tread. The more I focused, the more the road felt like it was dragging. Each bend came slower, each straightaway stretched out. My hands ached from holding the wheel so tight. I checked the gauges. Fuel was fine, engine temp fine, everything steady. There was nothing wrong with the truck. The only thing wrong was the way time and distance weren't matching up. Finally, at 120, the canyon spit me out. One moment I was still inside that narrow rock corridor, staring at familiar walls, and the next I was rolling onto the open desert highway where the land flattened and the stars spread wide again. Relief hit me hard, but it was tangled with confusion. I should have been out by 12:30, 12:40 at the latest. Instead, I'd spent more than an hour and 15 minutes in a stretch that never takes more than 30. When I checked my phone, I had a couple of missed calls. Folks wondering why I hadn't checked in. I hadn't even noticed the lack of reception drop lifting until I was already clear of the canyon. To this day, I've gone over it in my head 100 times, and I can only chalk it up to fatigue. When you're bone tired, your brain doesn't process things right. You can convince yourself you're seeing the same landmark again, that time is slipping faster or slower than it should. Maybe I really was crawling through that canyon slower than I realized, distracted by the haze of exhaustion. Maybe my eyes doubled up the scenery, made me think I was looping when really I wasn't. The most reasonable explanation is exactly that. I was tired, my perception was off, and I hallucinated just enough to trick myself into thinking I'd been caught in some kind of loop. But the thing that unsettles me, even now, is that I wasn't alone in that recognition. On other nights when I've swapped stories with fellow drivers, a couple of them admit they've had their own moments on canyon highways or long desert stretches where time didn't line up right, where landmarks repeated, where they lost half an hour without knowing how. It seems to happen in those quiet, empty places where your mind has nothing to cling to but the hum of the truck and the shadows around you. I made it home fine that night, parked the rig, and got the rest I should have had before I left. Life went on. But every time I drive through that canyon now, I make sure I'm rested. I keep the window down, the air biting at my face, and I focus hard on every turn. Because once you've felt time slip sideways on you like that, once you've stared at the same butte 2-3 times when logic says it should be behind you, you don't forget. In the end, there was no mystery, no supernatural trick. Just a tired mind, a lonely stretch of road, and the way fatigue can warp reality into something that feels impossible. Still, that night taught me a lesson I'll never let slip again. On the road, exhaustion is its own danger, and sometimes it's the scariest one of all. I've been out on the road long enough to know there are stretches of highway that don't play fair with your head. Places where the miles don't feel right, where the clock on your dash doesn't line up with what your body swears is true. I call them soft places. You can be sharp, well-rested, paying attention to every mile marker, and still come out the other side wondering what happened to the time in between. It was late summer when I ran into one of those stretches again. I had a load of steel running through the Midwest, headed south toward Oklahoma. Nothing unusual about the run. The weather was clear, the sky heavy with stars, and the highway stretched out flat for miles in every direction. I'd fueled up, eaten, and was settling into the long pull of night driving, figuring I'd get a solid chunk done before stopping. The night was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. The radio faded into static not long after I left the last town, so I shut it off and let the hum of the engine take over. The road ahead glowed white under the beams, the edges of the asphalt bleeding into black fields and brush. Now and then a fence line flashed by, or the silhouette of a tree standing alone out in the dark. Otherwise, it was just me, my rig, and the endless line of highway. Time felt normal at first. I checked the clock at midnight, noting the miles I'd made, the distance left to the next fuel stop. The numbers lined up. Everything felt steady. I kept sipping coffee from the thermos, tapping the wheel with my fingers, keeping myself alert. But then the rhythm of the night started to change. It's hard to explain unless you've felt it yourself. The road ahead looked the same, but something in the way the lines passed under me felt off. The gaps between the reflectors seemed longer than they should have been. The space between the mile markers stretched. I started to wonder if I was just tired, if my brain was playing tricks. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, sat forward straighter in the seat. Still, the feeling stayed. At some point, I glanced at the clock again, and that's when I realized something wasn't right. It read 1:15 a.m. That didn't line up with the mileage. I should have been at least 50 miles further down the road than I was. I checked the odometer, checked the GPS unit mounted on the dash, but the numbers didn't add up. I had burned through an hour of driving without covering the ground I should have. Prickle ran down my spine. The soft places don't announce themselves. You just suddenly realize you've been swallowed by one. The outside world looks the same. Black fields, white lines, empty road. But inside the cab it feels heavier, slower, like time itself is dragging. My foot pressed the accelerator the same as always, but I couldn't shake the feeling the truck wasn't eating up the miles like it should. I kept driving, eyes glued to the dash, then back to the road, then to the mirrors. Nothing changed, but nothing felt right either. My sense of distance warped. It was like walking a hallway where the door at the end never seems to get closer. The fuel gauge caught my eye next. I had topped off before leaving the last stop, enough to run for hours without worry. But the needle was sinking faster than it should have been. I watched it drop another notch within a span of 20 minutes. My stomach tightened. The numbers didn't add up. I ran through the math in my head, how much fuel I should have burned, and it didn't match what the gauge was showing. The silence in the cab grew heavier. No music, no chatter, just the low rumble of the engine and the endless rush of tires. I felt like the road was wrapping around me tighter and tighter, pulling me further into a place where the usual rules didn't hold. I gripped the wheel harder, flexed my fingers, tried to remind myself it was just fatigue, just the tricks of night driving. But deep down I knew better. 2 a.m. rolled around. At least that's what the clock said. I had been pushing straight through, but the odometer showed less distance covered than I could accept. I should have been pulling up on the edge of the next town, lights glowing faintly in the distance. Instead, there was only more darkness, more empty road. The longer I drove, the worse the weight in my chest got. It wasn't panic exactly, more like a deep unease, the kind that gnaws at you slow. I started counting the reflectors along the guardrail just to keep my mind steady. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Over and over until the numbers blurred together. I forced myself to check the gauges every few minutes, making sure nothing was slipping. The fuel kept draining faster than it should. My eyes darted to the horizon, hoping for a sign of life, a glow, anything. But the world stayed black and endless. When the clock finally ticked past 3, I spotted a glow in the distance. Faint at first, then growing brighter. Relief hit me so hard I felt it in my chest. It was a truck stop, lights burning yellow against the night. The sign flickered as I pulled closer, but I didn't care. It was something real, something solid. I pulled off the highway and rolled into the lot, my rig shuddering as I cut the engine. The silence after the motor died was thick, but this time it was different. I could hear the faint buzz of neon, the clank of something metal out back, even the muffled hum of another engine idling somewhere in the lot. It was noise, life, proof I was back in the world again. I climbed down, legs stiff, and looked up at the sky. The stars were still there, sharp and bright, but the air felt lighter, like whatever grip the highway had on me had finally let go. Inside the station, I grabbed coffee and walked around just to feel my legs move. The clock on the wall read 3:20. I checked it against my phone, same time. Somehow, those hours had gone, stretched thin across the blacktop, leaving me with fewer miles than I should have had and more fatigue than I could explain. Back in the cab, sipping the hot coffee, I thought about the soft places. They're not on a map. You don't get a warning before you hit one. But if you're out on the road long enough, you'll find them. Stretches where time gets fuzzy, where the rules don't hold steady, where the world feels like it's shifted a little out of place. I slept at that truck stop before heading on. The rest of the run went normal, the miles clicking by like they were supposed to, the clock lining up again. But that night stayed with me, not because of what I saw, but because of what I lost. Hours that vanished, fuel that drained too quick, a stretch of road that felt more like a trap than a path. It was real, though. No ghosts, no monsters, just the way the road can bend time when you're out there in the dark, running heavy, pushing your limits. Soft places are real, and once you drive through one, you'll never forget the way it feels. That's what happened to me, and it's why I still keep one rule, no matter what. When the clock starts to feel wrong and the miles don't match, I pull over. Because time gets fuzzy in the soft places, and the road doesn't always give it back. I've spent more nights than I can count behind the wheel of my rig, rolling down endless highways while the rest of the world sleeps. I used to think the road at night was peaceful. The way the sky swallows everything in black, the way the hum of the tires turns into a rhythm that lulls you into a strange calm. But over time, I've learned that the quiet of the road can be the most unnerving thing of all. There's one night I'll never forget, and even now, thinking about it makes the back of my neck prickle. It was late, way too late for me to still be out driving. I had already put in more hours than I should have, but I was running on caffeine and stubbornness, trying to make it to my drop before morning. I had told myself I'd pull over at the next rest stop, but those words always came with another mile, and another, until suddenly there was no rest stop in sight and the clock on the dash read past midnight. The highway was deserted. No headlights behind me, no taillights ahead, just a stretch of black road unspooling through the night. The only sound was the constant growl of the engine and the hiss of the tires on the asphalt. Every so often, I'd pass a faded mile marker or a reflector nailed to a guardrail, and the flash of white against the darkness reminded me how empty it really was out there. Fatigue is a strange thing when you're driving a truck. It doesn't hit you all at once. Creeps up slow, like fog rolling in, until your thoughts blur together and your sense of time gets slippery. I felt my eyelids getting heavy, and the hum of the engine started to sound less like noise and more like a lullaby. I knew I needed to wake myself up, so I opened the window a crack, letting the cold air sting my face. It worked for a while, but the drowsiness kept creeping back in. The road stretched straight ahead, and after a while, I started to feel like I'd been driving the same mile over and over. The same cracks in the pavement, the same sloping shoulder, the same dark silhouette of trees against the horizon. I glanced at the clock, thinking maybe 20 minutes had passed, but it showed almost an hour since the last time I had checked. That shook me a little. Time had slipped away from me, and I didn't remember a single detail of that hour. I tried to think back, what songs had played on the radio, what mile markers I had passed. But there was nothing, just a blank stretch of nothing. I tightened my grip on the wheel and leaned forward, forcing myself to pay attention. My heart beat a little harder now, and I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion, nothing more. The road does that to you when it's late and you're running on fumes. Still, something about that blank hour wouldn't leave my head. It was like the highway had swallowed up a piece of me and left no trace behind. Up ahead, a rest area sign glowed faintly in the dark. Relief washed over me. I told myself I'd pull in, park, and grab an hour of sleep before pushing on. The ramp curved off the highway, and I slowed my rig, rolling into the lot. It was empty, not a single car or truck in sight. The overhead lamps buzzed weakly, casting dull yellow light over cracked pavement and overflowing trash bins. I parked at the far end, killed the engine, and sat in silence for a moment. The sudden stillness was jarring after hours of noise and vibration. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and tried to shake off the unease that clung to me. But the quiet was too deep, too unnatural. Even in remote rest stops, you usually hear something. The distant whoosh of a car on the highway, the hum of insects, maybe the rustle of wind through the trees. Here there was nothing. It was so silent I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was just an off night. Maybe the rest stop wasn't used much. Maybe the cold air had driven away the bugs. But the longer I sat there, the more that silence pressed in on me. Couldn't relax. My chest felt tight, and I kept scanning the edges of the lot, watching the line where the light from the lamps gave way to black. Minutes passed like hours, and sleep wouldn't come. My eyes burned, my body ached, but every time I closed my eyes, I snapped them open again, convinced something was out there in the dark. I thought about getting out, stretching my legs, maybe walking to the restroom, but the idea of stepping into that silence froze me in place. Finally, I gave up. Rest wasn't happening here. I fired the engine back up, the rumble breaking the suffocating quiet, and steered back onto the highway. The moment the wheels hit the road again, I felt some of the pressure lift. Movement felt safer than sitting still in that dead silence. But the strangeness didn't end there. Not long after I left the rest stop, I noticed the fuel gauge. Before I had pulled off, it had read just under half a tank. Plenty to get me to the next town. Now, not 20 minutes later, the needle hovered close to empty. My heart lurched, and I checked the dash again, thinking maybe I'd misread it. But no, it was sinking lower, inch by inch. I hadn't driven nearly far enough to burn that much fuel. My rig wasn't leaking, there was no smell of diesel, no warning lights. It didn't make sense. The dark highway stretched on, mile after mile, and the needle kept dropping. I watched it like a hawk, every mile tightening the knot in my stomach. Finally, the low fuel light blinked on, the orange glow taunting me in the cab. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, running out of gas was the last thing I needed. I slowed down, easing off the accelerator, trying to conserve what I had left. I scanned the sides of the road desperately, praying for a gas station sign. The radio crackled faintly, static more than music, and the dashboard lights seemed dimmer than usual. I felt like the whole truck was draining of energy, sputtering towards some inevitable stop. At last, just when I thought I'd be stranded, I saw the glow of a small station up ahead. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. I pulled in, coasting to the pump, and cut the engine. My hands were trembling as I climbed down, the cold air biting at me. I filled the tank, watching the numbers climb higher than they should have for how much I thought I'd burned. When I finally got back into the cab, the fatigue slammed into me like a hammer. My body felt lead-heavy, my eyes gritty with exhaustion, but the unease was still there, humming under my skin. I had lost time on that road. I had burned fuel I couldn't account for, and I knew, without any doubt, that pushing further into the night would only make it worse. I parked right there at the edge of the station lot, shut everything down, and crawled into the sleeper. For the first time that night, surrounded by the faint hum of the station lights and the distant sound of a cooler fan, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The rest of the trip went on without anything unusual, but that night stuck with me. Not because of anything supernatural, but because of how real it was. The late hour, the fatigue, the silence, the way the road warped time and distance when I wasn't sharp enough to hold on to it. I learned a lesson that night, one that's kept me alive ever since. The road doesn't forgive exhaustion. You push too hard, and it pushes back in ways you can't always explain. It was way too late for me to be driving that night, and I'll never forget how it felt.